It was April 1968, just north of Quang Tri, and the ground was still warm from the firefight that had ended hours before. Smoke drifted through the canopy in thin, ghostly columns. The jungle had swallowed the sounds of battle, the screaming engines, the crack of small arms fire, the thunder of cannon rounds tearing through foliage, and left only silence in its wake. But the silence was not peace. It was the kind of quiet that follows violence, heavy and watchful, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. And in the center of a cratered clearing, half buried in mud and scorched vegetation, sat the machine that had caused it all. 52 tons of American steel. Motionless. Defiant. The M48 Patton tank loomed over the battlefield like a monument to industrial power, its turret twisted slightly to the left, its main gun angled toward the treeline as if still searching for a target. Vines had already begun creeping up its tracks. The hull was pockmarked with small arms fire, and a dark streak of soot ran down one side where a fire had burned itself out. But even in defeat, even abandoned and silent, the tank radiated something unmistakable: presence. North Vietnamese soldiers emerged from the jungle slowly, rifles raised, eyes scanning the wreckage for movement. They had fought American armor before, had heard the roar of its engines, felt the ground shake beneath its treads, watched their positions disintegrate under its cannon fire. But they had never been this close. Not like this. Not when it was quiet. Not when they could touch it. One soldier reached out and placed a hand on the hull. The metal was still warm. Within hours, Soviet advisors arrived. They came with cameras, notebooks, and an urgency that made the Vietnamese soldiers step back. These men were not frontline fighters. They were engineers, intelligence officers, men who understood the language of machines. And as they circled the captured M48, their expressions shifted from curiosity to something closer to concern. This was not just another tank. This was a window into how far ahead the Americans really were. The M48 Patton had not been designed for jungles. It had been born in the cold calculus of the early Cold War, a weapon forged to meet Soviet armor on the plains of Europe. Its designers had imagined vast, open battlefields, rolling hills in Germany, frozen steppes in Poland, places where speed and firepower could be unleashed without restraint. The M48 was built to fight the Third World War, not a guerrilla insurgency in Southeast Asia. But history has a way of bending intentions, and by the mid-1960s, the M48 found itself deep in the mud and heat of Vietnam, doing something it was never meant to do, fighting an enemy that refused to stand still. The tank had evolved through necessity. The original M48, introduced in 1952, had been plagued with problems: an underpowered engine, a fire-prone fuel system, a gun that couldn't hit targets reliably at long range. But by the time it reached Vietnam, it had been refined, upgraded, and hardened into something far more dangerous. The M48A3, the variant most commonly deployed in-country, featured a diesel engine that replaced the volatile gasoline system, improved suspension that could handle the brutal terrain, and upgraded optics that allowed crews to spot targets through dense vegetation. It was heavy, it was loud, it was thirsty for fuel, but it was also nearly unstoppable. American tank crews called it the Patton, with a kind of rough affection. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't graceful. But it got the job done. And in the chaos of Vietnam, where nothing worked the way it was supposed to, that was enough. The North Vietnamese, meanwhile, had their own armor, Soviet-supplied T-54s and T-55s, workhorses of communist mechanized warfare. These tanks were simpler, lighter, easier to maintain. They had been designed with a different philosophy: build them fast, build them cheap, build them in numbers. A T-54 could be operated by a conscript with minimal training. Its mechanical systems were crude but reliable. Its armor was thick enough to stop most rounds, and its 100mm gun could punch through almost anything it faced. On paper, the T-54 was a formidable machine. But tanks are not fought on paper. The Soviet advisors spent the first hour just trying to get inside. The commander's hatch was jammed, twisted slightly from the explosion that had disabled the tank. 2 Vietnamese soldiers climbed onto the turret with crowbars, prying at the heavy steel lid while the Soviets watched from below. When it finally gave way, one of the advisors, a balding man named Volkov, an engineer from the Ural Tank Works, hauled himself up and peered inside. What he saw made him pause. The interior of the M48 was a cathedral of engineering. Even in the dim light filtering through the open hatch, Volkov could see the intricacy of it, the hydraulic systems running along the turret walls, the precision-machined gears of the gun elevation mechanism, the padded seats for the crew, the neatly organized racks of ammunition. Everything was labeled, everything had its place. The rangefinder optics gleamed like jewels. The radio equipment, though smashed in the fighting, was far more sophisticated than anything the North Vietnamese used. Even the fire extinguishing system, automatic, triggered by heat sensors, was a marvel of forethought. Volkov lowered himself inside and ran his hand along the turret traverse controls. Powered. Fully stabilized. The gunner could track a target while the tank was moving at full speed over rough terrain, and the gun would stay locked on. Soviet tanks had nothing like this. The T-54's gun had to be aimed manually, adjusted by the gunner with a hand crank, and firing accurately on the move was nearly impossible. He moved to the driver's compartment. The seat was adjustable. The controls were smooth, responsive, designed for long hours of operation. The engine compartment, visible through an access panel, was a masterpiece of mechanical organization, neat, modular, designed to be serviced quickly even under combat conditions. Soviet engines were brutally simple, packed tightly into cramped spaces where a single broken part could require hours of disassembly. This was different. This was built by people who understood that a tank was not just a weapon. It was a machine that had to be lived in, maintained, and trusted. Volkov climbed back out and lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. "What do you think?" one of the Vietnamese officers asked. Volkov took a long drag and stared at the tank. "I think," he said slowly, "that we have been underestimating them." The comparisons began immediately. Back at Soviet intelligence headquarters in Hanoi, Volkov and his team compiled their findings into a classified report that would eventually make its way to Moscow. The language was careful, technical, stripped of emotion, but the conclusions were undeniable. The M48's 90mm gun was nominally less powerful than the T-54's 100mm cannon. On paper, the Soviet gun fired a heavier shell with more kinetic energy. But in practice, the M48's fire control system made it devastatingly more effective. The coincidence rangefinder, an optical system that allowed the gunner to measure distance with extraordinary precision, gave American crews the ability to land first-round hits at ranges where Soviet gunners were still guessing. The gun stabilization system meant the M48 could fire accurately while moving, turning every engagement into a moving ambush. And the turret traverse, powered by hydraulics, allowed the gunner to track fast-moving targets with a speed that Soviet manual systems could never match. In a one-on-one duel, the T-54 had the firepower to kill an M48. But the M48 would see it first, aim faster, and fire more accurately. In tank warfare, that was everything. The armor told a similar story. The M48's hull was thicker, better sloped, designed to deflect incoming rounds rather than simply absorb them. Soviet armor was effective, but it relied on raw thickness, brute force over elegance. American armor was engineered, layered, optimized for weight distribution and deflection angles. And the M48's suspension, torsion bar systems with shock absorbers, allowed it to traverse rough terrain without losing speed or stability. The T-54 bounced and shuddered over uneven ground, exhausting its crew and slowing its advance. The M48 glided. Even the engine, a Continental AVDS 1790 diesel, producing 750 horsepower, was a statement of intent. It was loud, it was thirsty, it required constant maintenance. But it was also powerful enough to push the 52-ton tank to speeds of 30 miles per hour on roads, fast enough to outmaneuver Soviet armor in open terrain. The T-54's engine was reliable and efficient, but it could not match the raw power of the American system. Volkov's report included photographs, measurements, technical drawings. He wrote about the quality of the welds, the precision of the machining, the sophistication of the electrical systems. And in a final, carefully worded paragraph, he noted that the M48 represented a level of industrial capability that the Soviet Union could not yet match. Not because Soviet engineers lacked skill, but because American manufacturing tolerances, material science, and production infrastructure were simply operating at a different standard. The report was stamped, secret, and filed away. But its conclusions were already shaping strategy on the ground. The realization came slowly, painfully, over the course of 1968. North Vietnamese commanders had watched American armor in action before, but they had always assumed that with the right tactics, the right terrain, the right moment of surprise, they could overcome it. Soviet doctrine emphasized the offensive, the massed assault, the overwhelming concentration of force. If one T-54 could not defeat an M48, then send 3. If 3 were not enough, send 10. Numbers, the doctrine insisted, could overcome quality. But Vietnam was not the plains of Europe. There were no vast columns of armor maneuvering for position, no grand set-piece battles where quantity could be brought to bear. There were only narrow jungle trails, ambush points, river crossings, places where a single American tank, properly positioned and properly crewed, could hold off an entire battalion. And the North Vietnamese were learning, through bitter experience, that they could not afford to trade tanks with the Americans. Every T-54 lost was a strategic blow, a loss of irreplaceable equipment and trained crews. Every engagement where they tried to meet American armor head-on ended in disaster. The M48s were faster, more accurate, and, critically, supported by overwhelming air power and artillery that could be called in within minutes. So the strategy shifted. Ambush, mines, terrain. The North Vietnamese began to avoid tank-on-tank engagements entirely, focusing instead on disabling American armor through cunning and patience. They would plant mines along known routes, detonate them remotely, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. They would lure tanks into narrow defile where the thick jungle prevented them from maneuvering, then hit them with RPGs from close range, aiming for the thinner rear armor or the vulnerable tracks. They would let the tanks pass, then attack the supply convoys that followed, because a tank without fuel and ammunition was just a very heavy piece of steel. It was a recognition of reality. They could not match American firepower, so they would not try. They would fight differently. They would fight smart. The mines were particularly effective. Soviet-designed anti-tank mines, buried in the red clay of jungle trails, could shear through the M48's tracks, immobilizing it instantly. And an immobilized tank was a target. The North Vietnamese learned to be patient, to watch American movements, to identify the routes they favored and the times they traveled. They turned the jungle itself into a weapon, using the terrain's natural advantages to neutralize the technological superiority of their enemy. American tank crews learned to hate those trails. The tension of moving through dense vegetation, knowing that every meter of ground could hide an explosive device, wore on them. Some units began using mine rollers, heavy steel drums pushed ahead of the tank to detonate mines before they could reach the vehicle. Others relied on infantry to sweep routes before armor moved through. But nothing was foolproof, and the losses mounted steadily. Still, in open combat, the M48 remained dominant. When North Vietnamese forces tried to overrun American positions with human wave attacks, when they brought their T-54s forward to support infantry assaults, the Pattons cut them down with mechanical efficiency. The 90mm gun could fire high-explosive rounds that detonated on impact, turning bunkers into splinters and foxholes into graves. The coaxial machine gun, a .30 caliber weapon mounted parallel to the main gun, could sweep entire tree lanes, suppressing enemy fire while infantry maneuvered. And the commander's .50 caliber machine gun, mounted on top of the turret, gave the tank the ability to engage targets at extended ranges or suppress enemy positions while the main gun reloaded. The psychological impact was immense. North Vietnamese soldiers who faced M48s in battle described the experience in terms that bordered on the surreal: the unstoppable advance of the machine, the deafening roar of its engine, the way its rounds seemed to find them no matter where they hid. Some units broke and ran at the mere sound of approaching armor. Others stood and fought with desperate courage, knowing they were outmatched but unwilling to yield. For the American crews, the M48 was home. Cramped, noisy, sweltering in the tropical heat, but home nonetheless. 4 men lived inside that steel box, their lives measured in the rhythm of diesel engines and radio chatter, in the smell of gun oil and sweat, in the constant vibration of treads grinding over jungle trails. The commander, perched in the turret with a view of the world through vision blocks and periscopes. The gunner, hunched over his rangefinder, fingers on the trigger. The loader, moving shells from racks to breech in a choreographed dance of controlled violence. The driver, isolated in the front hull, navigating by instinct and feel, the tank responding to his touch like an extension of his body. They learned to trust the machine. Specialist David Cronin, gunner with the 1st Squadron, 1st Cavalry, remembered the first time his M48 took an RPG hit. They had been moving through a rubber plantation near Bien Hoa when the round struck the turret side, the impact sounding like a sledgehammer against a steel drum. The explosion was blinding, deafening, and for a moment Cronin was sure they were dead. But when the smoke cleared, the tank was still moving, the armor had held, and the only damage was a scorched patch of paint and a ringing in his ears that lasted for days. "You hear stories about Soviet tanks," Cronin said years later. "How they'd brew up if you looked at them wrong. How one hit and the whole thing would cook off. Our tanks? They took a beating and kept going. I saw M48s come back from missions looking like Swiss cheese, holes everywhere, but the crew walked away. That armor saved our lives more times than I can count." The reliability, though, that was what amazed them most. In a war where everything broke down, where the heat and humidity turned metal to rust and electronics to mush, the M48 just kept running. The diesel engine, for all its noise and fuel consumption, was nearly indestructible. Crews would joke that you could run it on cooking oil if you had to. The transmission, the suspension, the hydraulic systems, they required maintenance, constant care, but they worked. Day after day, month after month, the tanks rolled out on patrol and rolled back in, battered but functional. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, a tank commander with the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, described a mission in late 1968 where his platoon spent 3 days in continuous contact with enemy forces, moving through thick jungle and open rice paddies, engaging targets at ranges from 50 meters to over a kilometer. His tank fired 67 rounds, took multiple hits from RPGs and recoilless rifles, threw a track twice, and suffered a hydraulic leak that left the turret traverse sluggish. But it never stopped fighting. "We limped back to base on fumes," Hayes recalled. "The mechanics took one look at us and shook their heads. But 12 hours later we were back out. That's the M48. It didn't quit." The crew dynamics were critical. In the confined space of the tank, tensions could flare quickly, for men living in constant proximity, breathing the same stale air, sharing the same fear. But those same conditions forged bonds that lasted lifetimes. The loader learned to anticipate the gunner's needs, slamming shells into the breech with mechanical precision even while the tank bucked over rough ground. The driver developed an almost telepathic connection with the commander, responding to voice commands and hand signals without hesitation. The gunner trusted the commander's target identification implicitly, knowing that a split-second delay could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. They ate together, slept together, fought together. They learned each other's habits, quirks, fears. They covered for each other's mistakes and celebrated each other's victories. And when one crew member was rotated out or lost to injury, the replacement had to earn their place all over again, prove they could be trusted, that they understood the rhythm, that they would not break when the shooting started. Inside the M48, rank mattered less than competence. The commander might be an officer, but he relied on his crew absolutely. A good commander listened to his driver's assessment of terrain, trusted his gunner's judgment on target priority, valued his loader's feedback on ammunition status. A bad commander got his crew killed. The heat was relentless. Inside the closed-up tank, temperatures could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew would strip down to t-shirts and boots, drenched in sweat, gulping water from canteens that never seemed full enough. The smell was indescribable: diesel fumes, cordite, unwashed bodies, the metallic tang of hot steel. Vision blocks fogged from condensation. Hands slipped on greasy controls. Exhaustion became a constant companion. But they endured. Because they had to. Because the alternative was unthinkable. The captured tank near Quang Tri was never moved. The North Vietnamese tried, brought up engineers, studied the drivetrain, attempted to start the engine. But the damage was too extensive. The transmission had been shattered by the explosion that disabled it, and even if they could have repaired it, they lacked the tools, the parts, the expertise. The tank was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a product of an industrial system they could not replicate. Every component was precision-made, designed to exact tolerances, built with materials they did not have access to. It might as well have been a spaceship. So they photographed it, measured it, took samples of the armor plating and sent them to Moscow for metallurgical analysis. They removed the optical systems, the radio equipment, anything that could provide insight into American technology. And then they left it there, slowly sinking into the jungle floor, vines creeping over its hull, rust blooming on its surfaces. It became a landmark of sorts. Vietnamese soldiers would pass by it on patrol, and someone would always make a comment about its size, its weight, the sheer industrial arrogance of building something so massive and sending it halfway around the world to fight in a jungle. Some viewed it with respect, a recognition of the enemy's capability. Others saw it as a symbol of American hubris, a 52-ton monument to a war the United States could never truly win. Both perspectives held truth. The Soviet analysis of the armor samples confirmed what Volkov had suspected. The steel used in the M48's hull was of exceptionally high quality, alloyed with elements that increased hardness and ductility simultaneously, a difficult balance to achieve. The welding was flawless, the seams stronger than the surrounding metal. The casting process for the turret produced a structure with minimal internal stresses and uniform density throughout. Soviet manufacturing could produce similar results, but only in small batches and at tremendous cost. The Americans were doing it at scale, churning out tanks with a consistency that suggested their entire industrial base was operating at a level the Soviet Union was still striving to reach. The optical systems were even more revealing. The rangefinder used in the M48 was a masterpiece of precision engineering, with lenses ground to tolerances measured in microns. The coatings applied to reduce glare and improve light transmission were far more advanced than anything the Soviets had developed. Even the simple act of looking through the gunner's sight revealed the difference. The American optics produced a clearer, brighter, more stable image, making target acquisition faster and more reliable. One Soviet engineer who examined the captured equipment wrote in his report, "The Americans build tanks the way we build parade vehicles, with attention to detail that borders on excess. Every system is over-engineered, designed with redundancies and safety margins that seem wasteful until you realize they allow the vehicle to continue functioning under conditions that would disable our designs." This is not superior engineering in the theoretical sense, but superior manufacturing capability. They can afford to build things this way. We cannot. That assessment, more than any tactical analysis, captured the fundamental reality of the technological gap. The war ground on, and the M48 remained a constant presence in the American arsenal. By 1969, over 600 M48 Pattons were operating in Vietnam, spread across cavalry squadrons and armored battalions, supporting infantry operations and conducting independent sweeps through contested territory. They were not glamorous. They did not dominate the headlines the way helicopters and fighter jets did. But they were effective, and in the grinding, attritional nature of the Vietnam conflict, effectiveness was all that mattered. American armor doctrine evolved to fit the environment. Tank commanders learned to move slowly through dense jungle, using the vegetation as concealment rather than obstacle. They learned to coordinate with infantry, providing mobile firepower and protection while dismounted troops cleared terrain and marked enemy positions. They learned to respect the jungle's ability to hide danger, mines, RPGs, ambush positions hidden in thick foliage just meters away. And they learned that the M48, despite its size and weight, could adapt. In open terrain, the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta, the coastal plains near Da Nang, the tank's speed and firepower made it a devastating weapon. North Vietnamese forces learned to avoid engagement entirely, melting away into the countryside at the sound of approaching armor. In urban environments, during the Tet Offensive and the battles for Hue and Saigon, M48s provided the firepower needed to reduce fortified positions and suppress enemy strongpoints, their cannon rounds punching through walls and bunkers with brutal efficiency. But it was in the jungle, in the close, claustrophobic battles fought at ranges measured in dozens of meters, that the M48 proved its worth in ways its designers never anticipated. It was psychological as much as tactical. The sound of an M48, the deep rumble of its diesel engine, the metallic clank of its treads, the mechanical whine of the turret traverse, was unmistakable and terrifying. North Vietnamese soldiers would hear it approaching and know they had seconds to decide, stand and fight a machine that could shrug off small arms fire and respond with high explosive shells, or retreat and live to fight another day. Most chose retreat. There were exceptions, of course. Determined defenders with well-prepared positions could inflict serious damage on even the most heavily armored vehicles. RPG teams, firing from concealed positions at close range, could penetrate the M48's side or rear armor. Mines could disable the tracks, leaving the tank vulnerable to follow-up attacks. And sheer numbers, the human wave tactics that the North Vietnamese occasionally employed, could overwhelm isolated tanks through attrition and courage. But these were the exceptions. In the vast majority of engagements, the M48 dominated its battlefield. The tank crews developed their own rituals and superstitions. Some painted kill marks on their gun barrels, a practice officially discouraged but widely tolerated. Others gave their tanks names, personalizing the machines that kept them alive. Iron Maiden, Rolling Thunder, Bad Company, the names reflected a mix of bravado, dark humor, and genuine affection for the steel beasts they inhabited. They also developed a deep respect for the maintenance crews who kept the tanks running. The mechanics who worked through the night, covered in grease and sweat, replacing broken parts and jury-rigging repairs with whatever materials were available. The supply sergeants who scrounged for replacement tracks, road wheels, and engine components in a logistics system that was perpetually overwhelmed. The armorers who loaded ammunition, cleaned weapons, and ensured that every system was ready for the next mission. Without these men, the tanks were just expensive paperweights. Sergeant First Class Robert Kowalski, a maintenance supervisor with the 1st Tank Battalion, remembered the constant struggle to keep the M48s operational in the Vietnamese environment. The jungle was hell on machinery, he said. Everything corroded. Seals dried out and cracked. Filters clogged with mud and vegetation. The tracks wore down faster than they should have because of the abrasive soil. We'd get a tank back from a mission, and it would need 20 hours of work before it was ready to go out again. Sometimes more. The maintenance crews became artists of improvisation. When official replacement parts were unavailable, they fabricated their own. When specialized tools were lost or broken, they made do with hammers and wrenches. When manuals said a repair required sending the tank back to depot, they figured out how to do it in the field. The M48's modular design helped. Components could be swapped out relatively easily, and the engine could be pulled and replaced in a matter of hours if necessary. But the real secret was the crew's intimate knowledge of their machines. They could diagnose problems by sound, by smell, by the way the tank moved. They knew which quirks were harmless and which were warnings of impending failure. They developed a tactile understanding of the systems, a mechanical empathy that allowed them to keep the tanks running even when logic said they should be dead. This knowledge was passed down from veteran crews to new arrivals, part of an oral tradition that supplemented official training. The young gunner learned from the experienced loader. The replacement driver studied the habits of the outgoing commander. The entire unit functioned as a collective repository of hard-won wisdom about how to survive and fight in an environment that wanted to kill them. The North Vietnamese, meanwhile, continued to adapt. By 1970, their anti-armor tactics had become sophisticated and deadly. They studied American patterns, identified vulnerabilities, and exploited them with creativity and patience. Ambush sites were carefully selected for terrain advantages, narrow trails where tanks could not maneuver, river crossings where they were most vulnerable, areas with thick vegetation that limited visibility and prevented supporting fire. They learned to target specific weak points. The M48's tracks, despite their durability, could be severed by well-placed explosive charges. The engine grills, necessary for cooling, provided a potential vulnerability to fire from above, difficult to exploit, but possible for patient hunters willing to position themselves in trees or on hillsides. The ammunition storage, though protected, could be catastrophically dangerous if penetrated, turning the tank into a funeral pyre for its crew. They also learned to use combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry attacks with RPG teams and recoilless rifle positions. A squad would pin the tank with rifle fire, forcing the commander to button up and limiting his visibility, while anti-tank teams maneuvered for side shots. Mines would be planted along likely retreat routes, turning what should have been a tactical withdrawal into a death trap. The effectiveness of these tactics varied wildly depending on terrain, timing, and the skill of both attackers and defenders. In some engagements, American tanks swept through North Vietnamese positions with minimal resistance, their firepower and protection proving decisive. In others, tanks were knocked out, crews killed or captured, and American forces forced to retreat or call in air support to extract themselves from ambushes. But the fundamental calculus remained unchanged. The North Vietnamese could hurt American armor, but they could not defeat it in sustained combat. Every successful ambush required extensive preparation, perfect timing, and often resulted in heavy casualties among the attackers even when the tank was destroyed. The exchange rate, North Vietnamese lives lost versus American vehicles disabled, was not sustainable for conventional warfare. Which is why the war was never really conventional. The North Vietnamese understood, perhaps better than their American opponents, that this conflict would not be decided by armor clashes or technological superiority. It would be decided by will, the willingness to endure losses, to absorb punishment, to continue fighting year after year until the enemy's political will collapsed. Tanks could control ground, but they could not control hearts and minds. They could win battles but not wars. This understanding shaped every aspect of North Vietnamese strategy. They avoided set-piece battles where American firepower could be brought to bear decisively. They fought when conditions favored them and melted away when they didn't. They traded space for time, lives for strategic patience, accepting horrific casualties as the price of eventual victory. And in the end, they were proven right. The war ended as all wars do, not with the clash of armor but with the stroke of pens and the evacuation of embassies. The M48 Pattons were withdrawn, shipped back to depots in the United States or transferred to Allied forces around the world. Some were upgraded, modernized, fitted with new guns and electronics, and sent to serve in other armies for decades to come. The M48 family tree extended through multiple generations. Variants served with Israeli, Turkish, Greek, and Taiwanese forces well into the 21st century, a testament to the fundamental soundness of the design. Others were scrapped, their steel recycled, their history reduced to maintenance logs and fading photographs. But the stories remained. Veterans would gather at reunions, and someone would always bring up the tank. The time it saved their lives. The mission where everything went wrong but the M48 kept going. The feeling of invincibility, however illusory, that came from sitting inside 52 tons of American engineering. And they would talk about the enemy, the resourcefulness, the courage, the sheer determination of fighters who faced that machine with nothing but small arms and improvised weapons, and still kept coming. There was respect there. Hard-earned, grudging but real. David Cronin, the gunner who survived the RPG hit near Bien Hoa, eventually returned to Vietnam as a civilian in 2003. He visited old battlefields, now overgrown and peaceful, and tried to reconcile his memories with the reality of modern Vietnam. At one point, he met a former North Vietnamese soldier who had fought in the same region during the same period. Through a translator, they shared stories. The Vietnamese veterans spoke about the terror of facing American tanks, about friends who had died trying to stop them, about the relief when the armor finally withdrew. Cronin spoke about the constant tension, the fear of mines and ambushes, the weight of responsibility for his crew's lives. I asked him if he hated us, Cronin recalled, for having better equipment, better training, all the advantages. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "We didn't hate you for your tanks. We envied them. But we knew that the war wasn't about tanks." That conversation stayed with Cronin for the rest of his life. It crystallized something he had always sensed but never articulated, that the technological superiority of the M48, while tactically significant, was strategically irrelevant. The war was being fought on a level where armor and firepower could not reach. The M48 captured near Quang Tri in 1968 is still there, or what remains of it. Decades of jungle growth have swallowed it almost entirely. The turret is barely visible beneath a layer of vegetation, the hull half submerged in mud. Rust has claimed the steel, erosion has softened the hard angles, and time has done what no enemy weapon could, reduced the machine to ruin. Local villagers know of it, though few visit. It is a relic of a war they would rather forget, a piece of history better left undisturbed. But for those who know what to look for, it still holds power. The shape of the turret, the curve of the gun barrel, these things speak a language that transcends politics and ideology. They speak of industrial capability, of a nation's ability to project force across oceans, to manufacture precision and power on a scale that defied comprehension. The Soviet advisors who studied it in 1968 understood this. They saw not just a tank, but a statement. This is what we can build, this is what we can deploy, and this is what you must overcome. The North Vietnamese overcame it in the end, not through matching its power, but through refusing to fight on its terms. They won the war not because they built better tanks, but because they understood that the war was never really about tanks at all. It was about will, endurance, strategy, and the willingness to adapt. But that does not diminish the machine. Occasionally, researchers and historians make pilgrimages to the site. They photograph the wreckage, document its slow decay, and try to extract meaning from the rust and vines. Some see it as a symbol of American overreach, a monument to the futility of applying conventional military power to unconventional warfare. Others view it as a testament to engineering excellence, a reminder of what human ingenuity can create when resources and expertise are marshaled toward a single purpose. Both interpretations have validity. The M48 was simultaneously a triumph and a tragedy, a machine that performed brilliantly at its design task but was deployed in a conflict where brilliance could not guarantee victory. The M48 Patton was never the most famous American tank. That honor belongs to the Sherman of World War II, the Abrams of the Gulf War, the iconic vehicles that defined their eras and became symbols of American military might. The M48 was a workhorse, a transitional design, a tank that straddled two ages of armored warfare and never quite achieved the legendary status of its predecessors or successors. But it was there, in the jungles of Vietnam, when it mattered. It was there when infantry needed fire support, when ambushes needed to be broken, when strong points needed to be reduced. It was there when its crews needed a machine they could trust, a steel shell between them and a hostile world. And it was there, captured and studied, when the enemy needed to understand just how far behind they really were. Technology, in the end, does not win wars, but it shapes them. It dictates tactics, influences strategy, determines what is possible and what is not. The M48 represented a level of technological sophistication that forced its opponents to fundamentally change how they fought, to abandon conventional armor engagements, to embrace guerrilla warfare, to seek victory through methods that negated American strengths rather than confronting them directly. That is a legacy worth remembering. The design lessons learned from the M48 service in Vietnam influenced American armor development for decades. The importance of crew comfort and ergonomics, previously seen as secondary concerns, became central to future designs. The need for reliable engines and modular components that could be serviced in the field was reinforced. The value of sophisticated fire control systems and optical equipment, which had proven decisive in combat, drove further investment in these technologies. The M60, which began replacing the M48 in the late 1960s, incorporated many of these lessons. And the M1 Abrams, which revolutionized American armor in the 1980s, carried forward the philosophy that had made the M48 effective: build quality over quantity, invest in crew survivability, and never compromise on the systems that give tactical advantage. The lineage was clear, the lessons absorbed, the experience distilled into doctrine and steel. But the human stories, those were harder to preserve. Marcus Hayes, the tank commander who had fought through 3 days of continuous contact in 1968, returned home to Wisconsin in 1970. He brought with him a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and memories that would never fully fade. For years, he rarely spoke about the war. When people asked, he would deflect with jokes or change the subject. The question, "What was it like?" seemed impossible to answer in any way that would make sense to someone who hadn't been there. But in 1995, his grandson, a high school senior working on a history project, asked to interview him. Hayes agreed, and for 3 hours he talked about the M48, about the heat and the noise, about the crew he had trusted with his life, about the North Vietnamese soldiers who had fought them with courage and cunning, about the weight of command, the burden of ordering men into situations where they might die. The tank, he said at one point, was the easy part. You could maintain it, repair it, understand how it worked. It was logical. The hard part was understanding why we were there, what we were trying to accomplish, whether any of it mattered. The tank never asked those questions. It just did what it was built to do. His grandson asked if he was proud of his service. Hayes thought about it for a long time. "Proud of my crew," he finally said. "Proud of how we looked after each other, how we did our jobs even when nothing made sense. Proud of the tank, honestly. It was a hell of a machine, and it kept us alive. But proud of the war? That's a different question. One I'm still trying to answer." That ambivalence was common among Vietnam veterans, particularly those who had served in armor. They had performed their duties with skill and courage, had operated sophisticated machines under impossible conditions, had defeated their opponents in nearly every tactical engagement. And yet the war had been lost. The contradiction was difficult to reconcile, a wound that statistics and after-action reports could never address. In the Soviet Union, the lessons learned from the captured M48 sparked internal debates that lasted for years. Some military planners argued for a fundamental shift in tank design philosophy, pushing for greater investment in crew comfort, sophisticated fire control systems, and improved manufacturing quality. They pointed to the American example as proof that these factors could be decisive in combat. Others resisted, insisting that Soviet doctrine, mass production, numerical superiority, acceptable losses, had proven effective in World War II and would remain valid in any future European conflict. The debate was never fully resolved. Soviet tanks continued to prioritize simplicity and producibility over sophistication, but incremental improvements crept into later designs. The T-64, T-72, and T-80 all featured better optics, more ergonomic crew stations, and improved fire control compared to their predecessors. These changes were influenced, at least in part, by what Soviet engineers had learned from studying captured American vehicles. But the fundamental philosophical difference remained. Soviet tanks were tools of war designed to be used in vast numbers, operated by conscripts with limited training, and replaced when lost. American tanks were precision instruments, expensive and complex, designed to give professional soldiers a decisive advantage in combat. Neither approach was inherently superior, each reflected different strategic priorities, industrial capabilities, and military traditions. The M48 incident had revealed the gap between these philosophies, and while both sides learned from the encounter, neither fundamentally changed their approach. The jungle clearing where the M48 was captured has become, in recent years, a minor tourist attraction. Local guides occasionally bring visitors to the site, telling stories that blend history with legend. The tank itself is barely recognizable now, a corroded hulk slowly being consumed by the earth. Pieces have been carried away over the years as souvenirs. The gun barrel, long since rusted through, lies half-buried in mud several meters from the hull. The turret has collapsed inward, its internal machinery long since stripped or deteriorated beyond recognition. But people still come. Veterans from both sides, historians researching the war, curious travelers drawn by the narrative. They stand in the clearing, cameras in hand, and try to imagine what it must have been like in April 1968. The violence, the fear, the moment when North Vietnamese soldiers first approached this mechanical giant and realized what they had captured. A local man named Nguyen Van Ton, whose father fought in the war, serves as an unofficial caretaker of the site. He clears vegetation occasionally, preventing the jungle from completely reclaiming the wreckage. When visitors arrive, he tells them what he knows, stories passed down from his father and other veterans, mixed with information from books and documentaries. "My father said the tank was like a dragon," Ton explained to a group of American tourists in 2018. "A sleeping dragon, powerful even in defeat." The soldiers were afraid to approach it at first. They thought maybe it was booby-trapped, or that the Americans would come back for it. When they finally got inside, my father said the Russians who examined it looked worried. He didn't understand why at the time, but years later he realized they had seen how much further ahead the Americans were. One of the tourists, a former M48 crew member visiting Vietnam for the first time since 1969, asked Ton what happened to his father. "He survived the war," Ton said. "Raised a family, lived to see his grandchildren. He died in 2012. He used to say the war taught him that courage wasn't enough. That determination wasn't enough. That sometimes the other side just had better tools, and you had to be smarter to win." The veteran nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for further words. The technical specifications of the M48 Patton read like poetry to those who understand the language of armor warfare. Combat weight, 49.6 tons. Length, 28.3 feet. Width, 11.9 feet. Height, 10.2 feet. Main armament, 90 mm M41 gun with 60 rounds. Secondary armament, 1.50 caliber M2 machine gun, 1.30 caliber M1919A4 machine gun. Engine, Continental AVDS 1790-2 12-cylinder diesel, 750 horsepower. Maximum speed, 30 miles per hour. Range, 288 miles. Crew 4. These numbers, dry and clinical, cannot capture what the machine represented. They describe dimensions and capabilities, but they miss the essence, The roar of the engine at full throttle, the smell of cordite after firing the main gun, the way the tank settled into mud when stationary, the particular whine of the turret traverse motor under load. They don't capture specialist James Rodriguez's memory of his M48 pushing through a wall of vegetation and emerging into a clearing where an entire North Vietnamese company was caught in the open, or the 30 seconds of chaos that followed as his tank and two others engaged targets at point-blank range. They don't capture Sergeant Thomas Mitchell's description of the silence inside the tank after they took a mine hit, the crew frozen in shock for several heartbeats before training kicked in and they began emergency procedures. They don't capture the almost mystical bond between crew and machine, the way experienced tankers could feel when something was wrong through subtle changes in vibration or sound. The specifications tell you what the M48 could do. The stories tell you what it meant. In 1972, during the Easter Offensive, North Vietnamese forces launched their largest conventional assault of the war. 3 divisions, supported by hundreds of tanks and heavy artillery, poured across the DMZ and drove south toward Quang Tri. It was the kind of mechanized warfare the M48 had been designed for: open terrain, massed armor, clear lines of battle. American ground forces had been drawn down significantly by this point, but the remaining units still had their M48s, and they used them with devastating effect. The battle for Quang Tri became a brutal slugging match. North Vietnamese T-54s and PT-76 light tanks met American M48s in direct combat, the first large-scale armor engagements of the war. The results were lopsided. American tank crews, with their superior optics and fire control, consistently achieved first-round hits at ranges where North Vietnamese gunners were still acquiring targets. The M48's gun stabilization allowed it to fire accurately while moving, turning what should have been mutual ambushes into one-sided massacres. Staff Sergeant William Bradley, commanding an M48 with the 20th Tank Battalion, engaged 7 T-54s in a single afternoon near Dong Ha. His tank destroyed 5 confirmed, damaged another, and forced the last to withdraw. Bradley's crew fired 12 rounds total. The first miss was a range-finding shot, the rest were kills or near kills. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. It wasn't courage or skill, Bradley said later. It was the systems. We could see them before they saw us. We could hit them on the first shot. They were brave. They kept coming even after we'd knocked out half their unit. But they didn't have a chance. Our technology just ate them alive. The Easter Offensive ultimately failed, pushed back by a combination of American armor, air power, and South Vietnamese resilience. The tank battles had demonstrated, once again, that in direct combat American armor was virtually unbeatable. But they also demonstrated how irrelevant that superiority was to the strategic outcome. Within 3 years, the last American forces would withdraw, and North Vietnamese tanks, those same T-54s that had been so outmatched, would crash through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, ending the war. Technology had won the battles. Strategy had won the war. The M48 story extends far beyond Vietnam. In Israeli service, upgraded M48s fought in the 1967 Six-Day War, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and the 1982 Lebanon conflict. Israeli tankers, facing Soviet-equipped Arab armies, found the M48 to be reliable and effective when properly maintained and crewed. The Israelis made extensive modifications, adding more powerful engines, better armor, improved fire control, creating variants that bore little resemblance to the original design but retained its fundamental virtues of crew protection and firepower. In one famous engagement during the 1967 war, a single Israeli M48 commanded by Lieutenant Zvika Greengold held off Syrian armor for hours, destroying multiple T-54s and T-55s while waiting for reinforcements. Greengold's tank was hit repeatedly but continued fighting, the crew working through pain and exhaustion to keep their gun in action. When they finally withdrew, the tank was a smoking wreck, but all 4 crew members survived. The Turkish military operated M48s for decades, deploying them in border conflicts and internal security operations. Greek forces used them to maintain armor capability in the Aegean region. The Republic of China on Taiwan operated hundreds of M48s as the backbone of their armored forces well into the 2000s, gradually upgrading and modernizing them to extend their service life. Each nation's experience with the M48 added to its legacy, proving that the basic design was sound enough to be adapted for different tactical environments and strategic needs. The tank that had been built for the plains of Europe and blooded in the jungles of Vietnam proved versatile enough to serve in deserts, mountains, and urban terrain across multiple continents and decades. The engineers who designed the M48 never imagined its ultimate fate. The project had begun in the early 1950s, a rush effort to produce a more reliable and capable tank than the troubled M47. The design team at Chrysler's Detroit tank arsenal worked under intense pressure, balancing competing requirements for firepower, protection, and mobility. They made compromises, some wise and some less so, constrained by the technology of the era and the demands of military procurement. Many of those engineers lived long enough to see their creation tested in Vietnam. Some took pride in how well it performed. Others were troubled by the images that came back: burning vehicles, wounded crews, the human cost of mechanized warfare. A few participated in the post-war analysis, studying after-action reports and contributing to the next generation of American armor. Harold Benson, a hydraulic systems engineer who had worked on the M48's turret traverse mechanism, visited the National Armor and Cavalry Museum in 2004. At 82, moving slowly with a cane, he spent an hour examining a restored M48A3, the Vietnam variant. He ran his hand along the turret race, checked the placement of the hydraulic lines, peered into the crew compartment with an engineer's eye for detail. A museum volunteer asked if he had any connection to the tank. "I designed parts of it," Benson said quietly. 50 years ago. 50 years, and here it still is. "You must be proud," the volunteer said. Benson looked at the tank for a long moment. "I'm proud of the work," he said finally. "Proud that it did what we designed it to do, that it brought at least some of those boys home safe. But seeing it here, preserved like this, it's complicated. This machine was part of a war that cost 60,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese. That's not something to be proud of, no matter how good your engineering was." He paused, then added, "But I'm glad we built it well. If it had to exist, if those crews had to go to war, at least we gave them the best machine we could." The M48 Patton represents a moment in technological history, a point where American industrial capability reached a level of sophistication that few nations could match. It was not the most advanced tank of its era. The British Centurion had better armor. The Soviet T-62 had a more powerful gun. Other designs had features and capabilities that the M48 lacked. But the M48 was the culmination of a particular approach to warfare: build it well, crew it properly, support it completely, and trust that quality would overcome quantity in the chaos of battle. That approach had its limitations, as Vietnam demonstrated. Quality could not overcome geography, politics, or the fundamental disconnect between military objectives and strategic reality. But within its domain, the tactical engagement, the armored duel, the fight for ground and position, the M48 excelled. The tank's true legacy is not in the battles it won or the kill ratios it achieved. Its legacy is in the men who crewed it and survived, who came home and built lives and told stories. It's in the lessons learned and applied to future designs, the gradual evolution of doctrine and technology that those lessons enabled. It's in the grudging respect it earned from opponents who studied it, analyzed it, and understood that they were facing an adversary with capabilities they could not easily match. And it's in that rusting hulk in a Vietnamese jungle clearing, slowly returning to the earth, a monument to both human ingenuity and human folly. The jungle clearing is quiet now, as it was in the hours after the battle in 1968. The war has faded into history, the soldiers have gone home or gone to rest, and the machine itself is slowly being reclaimed by the earth. Vines grow through the vision ports, moss covers the armor, and the steel that once rang with the sound of combat is silent. Birds nest in the turret. Small animals shelter beneath the hull during monsoons. The jungle, patient and relentless, continues its work of erasure. But if you stand there, in that clearing, and look at the ruins of the tank, you can still feel it. The weight of industrial power. The audacity of transporting such a machine across an ocean to fight in a place it was never meant to be. The ingenuity of engineers who designed systems so sophisticated that even enemy experts could only marvel at them. And the grim reality of warfare, that all this precision, all this power, all this engineering brilliance, was built for one purpose: to kill and to survive. The North Vietnamese soldiers who captured that M48 in 1968 understood this. They touched the armor, climbed inside the turret, studied the machinery with the eyes of men who knew they could not replicate it. And they respected it, not because they admired the war it was designed to fight, but because they understood what it represented. Capability. Commitment. A nation's ability to build machines so advanced that even in defeat, even captured and disabled, they commanded awe. That is the story of the M48 Patton in Vietnam. Not a tale of victory or defeat, but a reminder that in war, as in all human endeavors, the tools we create define the struggles we undertake. The tank did not determine the outcome of the conflict, but it shaped the battlefield, forced adaptation, and left a mark on everyone who encountered it, enemy and ally alike. And somewhere in a jungle clearing north of Quang Tri, beneath the vines and rust, that mark remains. A testament to power, a reminder of limits. A monument to the machines we build and the wars we fight with them. Silent now, but never forgotten. The diesel engines are cold. The hydraulic systems are dry. The optical instruments are fogged and useless. But the steel endures, slowly dissolving into oxide and returning to the earth from which it came, completing a cycle that began in American foundries and blast furnaces decades ago. This is how all things end. Not with thunder and fire, but with rust and silence, with patient entropy, with the jungle's slow reclamation of ground that was briefly, violently contested. The M48 Patton fought its war. It did what it was built to do. And now it rests, a fading memory of battles long finished, of technologies overtaken, of a conflict that changed nations and shaped generations but could not, in the end, be won by machines alone. That is perhaps the tank's final lesson, that human conflicts cannot be resolved through engineering, that strategic wisdom cannot be manufactured in foundries, and that the most sophisticated weapon is still just a tool, effective within its domain, but ultimately subject to forces larger than firepower and armor. The clearing is quiet. The war is over. The tank remains, slowly vanishing, taking its stories with it into rust and memory. And the jungle grows on.